Now that we've completed the modeling portion of the project, it's time to move on to the UVW mapping. UVWs, which are known as UVs in Maya, are the conduit through which two-dimensional images are applied to three-dimensional models. There are almost as many tools, techniques, and approaches for UVW mapping as there are for modeling, and I'm going to restrict this to the very basics of mapping because it can be overwhelming to try to work with too many of the tools and operations in your first outing with mapping. But it's important to understand that while the UVW mapping tools and techniques can be quite intricate and technically challenging, the relationship between the texture images, the UVWs, and the model are always extremely simple. The models you work on will grow more complex, particularly as you get into character and creature modeling, and the number and complexity of textures you paint will increase. But at the most basic level, it's always going to be the same simple relationship. Two-dimensional UVWs are assigned to a three-dimensional model, and then two-dimensional texture images are applied via those two-dimensional UVWs. As you may be aware, sculpting applications like ZBrush and Mudbox, among others, allow you to paint directly on the 3D model as opposed to painting textures in a 2D paint application such as Photoshop. And you can actually paint in 3D directly on the model in 3ds Max and Maya as well. But again, behind the scenes of painting directly on those 3D models in any application, you are still painting two-dimensional textures that are being applied to a 3D model via those two-dimensional UVWs. I'm going to cover the basics of mapping with some simple models first before moving on to the UVWs for the headphones model, because I think it'll be easier for you to understand the fundamental relationship between the model and the textures that the UVWs establish by working with a simple object first. So a few important facts to understand up front. First, there is one UVW vertex for every vertex on your model. There is one UVW edge for every edge on the model, and there is one UVW polygon for every polygon on the model. Second, while this one-to-one relationship exists between the subobjects on the model and the UVW subobjects, the subobjects on the model can be moved, rotated, and scaled without moving, rotating, or scaling the UVW subobjects. And conversely, the UVW subobjects can be moved, rotated, and scaled without moving, rotating, or scaling the model subobjects. It's really important to understand that these are immutable facts about the relationship between the model and the mapping, no matter the model you're attempting to map and no matter the tools or software you use to map that model. So the first demonstration I like to use is this simple box, and please imagine that this is an actual cardboard box in the real world. That will make this easier to envision. Imagine that you wanted to project a two-dimensional image from a film projector onto all 6 sides of this three-dimensional box at the same time. Would it be possible to do that with the box in its current state? The answer is no, because no matter where you position the projector, you can simply never hit each side of the box at the same time. So in order to accomplish this, you would need to cut the box along its edges to flatten it out, which I'm sure you've done at some point in your life. I know I do it almost every week when it comes time to put boxes out for recycling. You would have to cut the box along 7 of its edges in order to flatten it out, which I've simulated with some animation here. And now you could project a single image onto the box and hit all 6 sides at the same time. This is what you would want the UVWs to look like in order to map this box. So this box here on the right isn't mapped yet. In order to see its UVWs, I'll add an unwrap UVW modifier to the box and open the Edit UVW window by clicking on the UV Editor button. As you can see, if I select each polygon on the model, all of the polygons for each side are sitting on top of one another in the UVW template for this model. But you can see if I move any of the UVW vertices, edges, or polygons, the corresponding subobjects on the model don't move. Conversely, if I move any of the subobjects on the model, it has no effect on the position of the UVW subobjects in the Edit UVW window. So how would I go about mapping this model to reflect the splayed out, flattened configuration you see on the actual box on the left? Again, there are numerous ways to go about this, but I'm going to show you just one method that I feel is the simplest and easiest to understand. I'm going to use strictly planar projections because it essentially takes a flat, two-dimensional photograph of the selected UVW subobject or subobjects. And as we just went over, UVWs need to be two-dimensional or flat because textures are two-dimensional or flat. So I'll click on the planar projection button from the projection tab under my unwrap UVW modifier. So you can choose any axis for the planar projection, and you'd want to choose the axis that is pointing directly at the selection. So if I were going to map the front polygon on the box first, you can see that that would be the y-axis because that's the one that's pointing directly at that selection. And then, if I were going to map the top polygon on the box, that would be the z-axis, because that's the one pointing at that selection. For the polygon on the left side, it would be the x-axis. So I'll start with the front polygon by selecting it, clicking the planar projection button, setting my planar projection axis to y, and that will create a planar projection of that polygon from that axis. And this is one of the things that trips up a lot of students. You have to click the planar projection button again to deactivate the projection to be able to move the resulting cluster in the Edit UVW window. So if you ever try to move that cluster and you find that you can't do it, chances are you forgot to deactivate that planar projection button. So what that did was make a flat projection for that polygon from that specified axis. But each projection is going to be placed in the center of the texturing space in the Edit UVW window. So with each projection, I need to move it away from the center because all of the UVW clusters must be arranged in just this upper right quadrant here without overlapping each other at the end of this process. In a minute, we'll go over why UVW clusters or polygons can't overlap each other except in specific circumstances where you want identical parts of a texture to be applied to more than one area of the model. But I would continue with this process of creating the planar projections for each side of the box so that eventually I will have each projection separate from one another. But polygons have two sides, a front and a back. So if I wanted to make a projection for the polygon on the back of this box and I selected the y-axis again, you'll see that the projection is made from the same angle as the front polygon. You can see if I select this UVW that's on the top left, that projection of the back polygon was made from the front camera and not the back. So I think the most straightforward way to go about this is, instead of selecting an axis to use for the projections, simply go into the axonometric camera view that's looking at the front side of the polygon or polygons you have selected. And again, those are the camera views that don't have the depth, so not the perspective view. The front, back, top, bottom, left, and right cameras. Go into the camera view that's looking at the front side of the polygon or polygons you have selected, and then click the View Align button here, which aligns the projection to the current camera view. Now, instead of creating that projection for the polygon on the back using the y-axis, which got us the back of that polygon instead of the front, I go into the front viewport, switch to the back camera, and now when I click planar, I immediately click the View Align button. Again, deactivate the planar projection button, and then move that projection away from the center. Now if I select that same UVW vertex again, you can see that this time it's created the projection from looking at the front side of that polygon because it used the back camera. So that's how I suggest you go about this. And while with this simple box, it's easy to tell whether the camera is looking at that polygon because it can see whether it's red or not in shaded mode. But for complex models, it might not be so easy. But you can always figure out whether you're in the correct camera view by looking at the view axis in the perspective view and then comparing it to the view in the axonometric view. So if I wanted to create a projection for the polygon on the right side and I tumble my perspective view to look at that polygon, I see that I'm looking directly at the x-axis and the y-axis points to the right. So I can see that would be the right camera. However, if I wanted to create a projection for the polygon on the left side, I can see that the y-axis in the perspective view is pointing to the left. So I know I would have to switch the side camera to the other side, the left camera. So I'll go through those steps for each of the 6 sides. Select the polygon, go into the appropriate camera view, click the planar projection button, then the View Align button, deactivate the planar projection, and then move the projection away from the center. And I'll move the projection of the front polygon back to the center. Now I could map this model right now. I could select all of the UVW clusters, and a cluster is any contained UVW projection. So if the box were subdivided and each side had 4 polygons instead of just 1, for example, and I created each projection for the 4 polygons on each side, the collection of those 4 polygons would be 1 UVW cluster for each side. But I could select all of the clusters, click Pack UVs from the Tools menu in the Edit UVW window, which arranges the selected clusters inside the texturing area, which again is just this upper right quadrant here from the origin. And then I could render what's called a UVW template, which is the image of the UVW template that I would use as the guide for painting the textures, and then begin painting those textures in Photoshop. So I'll generate the UVW template from the Tools menu. I'll choose a size for the image, which should always be square because the area in the Edit UVW window where they are arranged is also square. So 256 by 256, 512 by 512, 1024 by 1024, 2048 by 2048. But the size you choose should be the smallest number of pixels you need for your texturing purposes. So if you had a lot of detailed graphics or text, you'll need enough pixels so that the textures won't appear pixelated when they're applied to the model. But I'll just choose 512 for this demonstration. Then select a file name and a location for the file, and I'll save mine in the images folder of my project directory. And then a file format. It doesn't really matter what format you save the UVW template because you can save off the textures from Photoshop in a different format. The edge color will be the color of the UVW edges in the image. I usually like to choose a color that I know isn't close to anything in my textures because it makes it easier to see those UVW edges clearly when painting the textures. So I'll choose this fluorescent green color. And then I'll hit Render UVW Template, and that will save an image of the UVW template in the specified folder. Then I'll open the image in Photoshop, create a new layer, and just quickly paint some color to demonstrate this for you. Then I'll save this off as my diffuse map. I prefer to save as Targa because it allows me to save as RLE, which stands for run length encoding. That keeps file sizes down by only recording changes in pixel data. So if you have 50 pixels of just black and then a white pixel, it will only record the first black pixel data until it runs into a change in pixel data. So that keeps the file sizes down. And if you're going to be working with textures with a lot of the same pixel value, which I would be considering my headphones are mostly black and red with only discrete areas of text and graphics, using Targa with run length encoding is a good idea. Now I'll hit the M key on my keyboard to bring up the material editor, drag and open material to the box, connect a bitmap to the diffuse channel, and then load that texture. And this is what we did with the image planes in an earlier tutorial as well. Now you can see that the texture has been applied to the box, and if we look at this in the Edit UVW window, and I could display this image in my Edit UVW window, you can see how it's been applied to the box based on its UVW template. If I select a polygon in the Edit UVW window and examine what colors are on it in the template, I can find that polygon on the model and see that those colors appear in the same manner on that polygon. And this, in essence, is how UVWs apply two-dimensional images to three-dimensional models. But if I were to take one of these clusters and move it so that it sits on top of another one, you'll see that the same part of the image is applied to both of those polygons in the same manner. And that's why you have to avoid overlapping polygons in almost all circumstances. In some cases, though, you'll want the same part of the texture to be applied to more than one area of the model. So for example, if you modeled a race car and the car has the same graphics and the same number on both doors, you would map the polygons that comprise each door in the same manner so that those two clusters are identical, and then you would place them directly on top of one another in the UVW template so that the same part of the texture is applied to both doors in the same way. But the clusters I've created here, which in this case happen to be comprised of only one single polygon each, aren't connected. I can still move each cluster separately. So in many cases, you'll want to connect the clusters you produce from those planar projections because you want contiguous collections of polygons anywhere you need to paint contiguous imagery, such as patterns like brick or plaid, graphics like decals, posters, logos, or text or numbering. I could connect some or all of these clusters simply by selecting one of the edges on one of the clusters, control selecting the corresponding edge on the adjacent cluster, which you'll see will be highlighted in blue, and that is the shared edge on that other cluster, and then click on the Stitch Custom button on the right here, or by going to the Tools menu and choosing Stitch Selected. That will move the clusters to line up the shared edges, and then sew the clusters together at those two edges to form a single cluster. Or I could connect all of the clusters into a single cluster, which I might want to do if the box were textured with a single contiguous pattern. Now, just like with the cardboard box, in order to flatten the box, you have to choose which edges to cut in order to flatten it out, right? Now, Just like with the cardboard box in real life, in order to flatten that box, you have to choose which edges to cut in order to flatten it out, right? If we watch this animation again, you can see that I chose to keep the bottom side of the box attached to the front side. I could have chosen to cut any of the other edges around that bottom side so that it would have remained connected to the back or either the left or right side of the box. So you have to make the same choices with the UVWs. There are always seams, always. And seams are the boundaries around any cluster. You simply can't flatten a three-dimensional model without seams, just like you couldn't flatten that cardboard box in real life without seams. Part of your job is to hide those seams in areas where the break between clusters won't break apart a pattern or a graphic or text. So if you followed what we just demonstrated here, you now understand what UVW mapping is, how UVWs apply two-dimensional images to three-dimensional models, how to create planar projections, how to move and stitch those projections to adjacent projections, how to move and sew those clusters to adjacent clusters, and how to design where the seams will lie. As you can see from the menu operations in the Edit UVW window as we were clicking through them, there are a bunch of other tools and operations to learn about UVW mapping, and as I mentioned, you will eventually work with more complex models which will require more complex mapping, and you will eventually begin painting textures directly on 3D models. But the fundamental relationship between the textures, the UVWs, and the model is always the same, even if the connection between those three things are hidden from you as you paint directly on the model. Now, for these headphones, as we discussed back in the very first video in Module 1, the headphones are largely comprised of large areas of flat black or flat red, which is partly why I chose this prop. And since those areas can be textured with flat color, I don't need to worry about mapping them in any particular way. In fact, I could select every polygon on the model that will be flat black, place them directly on top of one another in the UVW template, and then simply paint that area in the texture black. And I could do the same thing for all the red areas. It's only for the areas where there is a graphic or a pattern or text or numbering for which you'll need to create those planar projections. So I would start with the area in the middle of one of the cups where this graphic of what looks like a snake's head with horns lies. Select those polygons, go into the appropriate camera view, and create a planar projection. Then I'll move that to the side with grid snap turned on down here in the bottom right hand corner. And then I'll do the same exact thing with the other cup using the camera on the other side. And then move that cluster so that it sits directly on top of the cluster on the other side, because that horned snake head graphic is identical on both sides. I would go through the same process to create planar projections for every area where there are other graphics, everywhere there's a pattern, like this grid of openings at the top of each cup, and everywhere there is text, like the metal area where the name of the headphone model is at the top of each cup. Then I would arrange those clusters inside the texturing area so that the clusters that will get the most detailed painting, like the graphics and the text, are the largest clusters in my template, because the larger the area they comprise in that template, the more pixels will be assigned to that area, and the more pixels I'll have to paint with. And then for the other areas of flat black or flat red, and I have some other areas that are flat silver too, I'll simply select those polygons in those areas, and I've created selection sets for those flat black polygons, the flat red polygons, and the flat silver polygons by selecting those polygons in my unwrapped UVW modifier and creating a selection set simply by typing in the desired name into the Create Selection Set field on the menu bar here and then clicking Enter. And selection sets are just quick ways of organizing selections of objects and or sub-objects so that you can quickly select them again. And then I'll use something called Flatten Mapping from the Mapping menu here in the Edit UVW window. Flatten Mapping simply applies planar maps to groups of contiguous polygons that fall within a threshold of a specified angle. And since these areas of the model are only getting flat color, I just take the resulting clusters and arrange them in the open areas of the template between the clusters that correspond to the graphics or patterns or text, so that all the clusters for the flat black areas are near one another, all of the clusters for the flat red areas are near one another, and all of the clusters for the flat silver areas are near one another. Now, it's important to understand that a good, solid, professional UVW template for a model will have specific projections for the entire model that correspond to the texturing plans. So every part of the model will be mapped in a specific way based on the needs of the textures. But you're asked to do quite a bit of work for this project in this course, and it's your first time working on something like this. So I'm going to suggest you do what I've done here. I've only created planar projections for the areas of the model that need texturing, so the graphics, patterns, text, and then simply use flatten mapping for the areas that are flat color. This will give you the experience of creating projections and mapping specific areas for your specific texturing plans without having to spend the time it would take to create sensible projections for the entire model. But as always, you're more than welcome to map your entire model if you want to get that experience. And as always, you can read about any of the more advanced mapping tools and procedures in the 3ds Max help.